guys, this is Jean, and I want to start with a warning. Now, this series is all about the awkward things we sometimes avoid talking about, especially in church. And last week, we talked about puberty. And this week, we're gonna talk about sex. Now, chances are, just hearing the word sex brought up a lot of different responses in the room. Some of us are excited, and some of us want to just hide. Some of us are immediately filled with guilt or shame. And some of us are curious. And some of us are just plain grossed out. Now, all of us have our own opinions, thoughts, and perspectives when it comes to sex and sexual things. But before you tune out because you think you know exactly what I'm gonna say about it, stick with me. There's so much more to this conversation than you may think. So since we're at church, you probably think the main point for today is this: that sex is bad and you shouldn't do it. And I understand why you might think that, but I think honestly, we all know there's more to it than that. So let me just start by saying this. Thinking that someone is good looking and having feelings towards them or about them are not bad things. In fact, sex isn't a bad thing. Believe it or not, that's actually the message I want you to hear today. Because the truth is, God made sex and God made you. Yeah, the same God who created you so wonderfully did so with a plan for your sexuality. Sexuality is how we express our sexual desires. It's how we act on our feelings and thoughts, and God created it. That means He's not surprised by it or grossed out by it. But because God created it, He does have some expectations about how we should handle it. Now look, I realize that even believing that God made sex and has a plan for your sexuality can be difficult for some of you. And that's probably because of what we said earlier. When you hear about sex at church, you almost always hear sex equals bad. Maybe all you've ever heard at church or at home is that sex is bad, that it's something you need to stay away from at all costs, especially in middle school. You're told that when you're married, then you can explore your sexuality. But until then, you better run. That's the message a lot of us grow up hearing from our parents or church leaders or other Christians in our lives. But then you hear about sex in culture with your friends, on YouTube, or in music, and it's the exact opposite. When you hear about it from those places, the message is that sex equals casual. To everyone outside of church, it seems like sexual activity isn't a big deal at all. It's just something people do or experiment with all the time. You hear stories or rumors at school that make it seem like it's just a normal part of everyone's daily life. With such mixed messages, no wonder we're confused. The problem with both of these viewpoints is that they are so extreme. The problem with both of these viewpoints is that they are so extreme. Sex can't be completely bad because God made it, but sex also shouldn't be something we just casually talk about or act on. Why? Well, because God made us and has a plan for our sexuality. So if the only way we think about sex is through one of these two viewpoints, I think we're missing the big picture. We're missing out on what God really wants us to understand about the way He made us. So how should we think about sex? When it comes to understanding God's plan for our sexuality and the way He wants us to think about sex, where do we even start? Where do we start? Now, one cool thing about Jesus is that He actually talked about things like sex. Yeah, the guy who Christians believe in, God, who is living and breathing on earth, actually brought up the awkward topic of sex. I mean, He didn't just pick a random time to talk about it either. In fact, Jesus addressed the topic of sexuality in one of His most famous talks ever. It's what we know today as the Sermon on the Mount. It's called that because Jesus was talking on the side of a mountain. Thankfully, his friend Matthew decided to write down what Jesus said that day so that we can read and remember it today. In this sermon, Jesus basically challenged and changed what these people had been taught about almost everything. He showed them a new way to live. And in one simple statement, Jesus gave us a new way to view sex. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." All right, let's stop here. Just like in our world today, back then there were a lot of different viewpoints about sex and sexuality. The people Jesus was talking to here knew what their Jewish religion had taught them, to not commit adultery. That basically means to not have sex with someone other than who they were married to. But they also knew that the people around them in other cities and cultures treated sex differently. And because of that, they were confused. That's why Jesus wanted to give them a clearer way to think about sex. So look at what he said next. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. When Jesus used the phrase, looks at a woman lustfully, he was talking about the way we think about or view someone else in a sexual way. And this probably surprised everyone. You see, for a long time, people had viewed sex as one thing, a physical act. Honestly, it's the same way most of us view sex today. But Jesus wanted us to understand that sex is so much more than just an action. It's about our minds too. It's about the way we think about and act towards other people. That too is a part of our sexuality. What Jesus wanted us to know is this: the way we think about sex is just as important as the way we act on those thoughts. Now let me stop right here and say this. It's so important that you understand that sexual attraction is not a bad thing. Remember, God created it, and God has a plan for it too. And part of that plan includes the way we see one another. We shouldn't view others as sexual objects. We should view others with value because God made them. When Jesus made this statement 2,000 years ago, he was stressing the importance of valuing others when it comes to sex. He wanted us to see that valuing others in both thought and action is a really important part of the way he created sex and sexuality. How do I know that? Well, look back at the scripture with me. Here, Jesus specifically mentioned that people shouldn't look at women with lustful thoughts. Now, this didn't mean he was talking only about viewing women sexually. He was making a point about the way we value all people with our thoughts. Jesus used this example because back then, women weren't viewed as equals. Instead, they were viewed as property. So crazy, right? I know it's hard to imagine, but in Jesus' time, women had very little value in their culture and were considered objects. So for Jesus to talk about the way women were supposed to be treated and valued was really different than what these people had been taught to believe. But Jesus did it not just to make a point about the way we value women, he did it to raise the bar for how all people are supposed to value all other people. He did it to show us that when it comes to sex, people weren't made to be treated like objects. Now this makes a ton of sense when we stop to think about it. Just last week, we looked at a verse in the Bible that gives us some insight into how God made us. To remind you, it says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. The powerful hand of God made every single person, and he made every person wonderfully. This is the way we need to think about each other. We should value all people like God made them. And that doesn't just include the way we actually treat them. It includes the way we think about them too. The way we think about, treat, and imagine other people should raise their value rather than reduce their value. Because God made us all of us are valuable. So how do you do this? How do you actually know if you're allowing your thoughts to drift towards treating someone like an object? How do you know if you're viewing someone with value? Well, for starters, if you're looking at another person and only thinking about how they can fulfill your sexual feelings, you're heading in the wrong direction. If the way you're thinking about a person would make them uncomfortable if they knew about it, you might need to check your thoughts. And if you're acting in a way that doesn't value another person's sexuality, then you definitely need to take a minute to think about if you're living the way God made you to live. To help us evaluate all that, I think we need to stop and ask ourselves a couple of questions. First, how can I view others with value? What can you change about the way you see others that shows them more value? I mean, guys, what if you made an effort to notice something great about like a girl's personality instead of her body? And girls, what if you decided to have fewer conversations about how a guy looks and have more about positive ways he treats others? What if you decided to stay off of Instagram or Snapchat to avoid looking at or asking for pictures that don't value other people sexually? What if you made the decision to stop looking at pornography because it's not the way God intends us to think about sex? And what if you even gave your small group leader permission to ask you some hard questions about the way you're viewing others. All of these things will help you practice viewing other people with value. Second, why should I view others with value? More than understanding how to view others, I think it's important to understand why we should view others with value. Here's the simplest reason you should care about this. Every time you view someone else as an object rather than a person with value, you're damaging your ability to have the kind of relationships God wants you to have. God created us to experience sex and think about it in a really healthy way. And the more we think about others in a way that devalues them, the harder it will be to actually treat them in a way that shows them value. Remember, our actions follow our thoughts. So if our thoughts aren't showing another person value sexually, our actions probably won't either. That's why it's so important to remember that sex is about so much more than just an action. It's about the way we view others too. And as Jesus reminded us, God made us all, so all of us are valuable. If the way we've talked about sex today has been different than what you thought it would be, that's probably a good thing. There are a bunch of different viewpoints about sex, but there's only one God who made sex, and He truly knows what's best. As you head out today, take some time to think about this question. What's one way I can give value to others with my thoughts?